1952, a psychologist named Kenneth Clark presented evidence to the United States Supreme Court that would change the country. Clark had conducted a series of experiments with black children, asking them to choose between black and white dolls and describe which doll was nice, which was bad, and which looked most like them. The children consistently attributed positive qualities to the white dolls and negative qualities to the black dolls. And when asked which doll looked most like them, many pointed to the black doll and then looked sad and confused or angry. Clark's research became central evidence in Brown v. Board of Education. The court cited it in establishing that segregated schools caused psychological harm to black children. But Kenneth Clark's story doesn't end with Brown v. Board of Education. It continues into territory that is directly relevant to what we're covering today. Clark was later asked to evaluate a young man who had been convicted of murder and was facing execution. He concluded that the defendant had significant intellectual disabilities, a conclusion that, if accepted, would have made execution unconstitutional under the Eighth Amendment. The state's attorney argued that Clark's had overstepped, that his role as an evaluator created a conflict with his role as an advocate, that the relationship between psychologist and subject had become something other than objective assessment. They were raising in a capital case a question that every clinician faces in practice. What are the boundaries of professional relationship? When does the role of helper conflict with other obligations? And what does the ethical code require when those roles come into tension? That question about role boundaries, dual relationships, and the clinician's obligation to multiple parties simultaneously is at the heart of everything we're covering today. And welcome to the Leicester Lifeline, the podcast that helps you pass your exam and grow as clinicians. I'm Matt, and today is a big episode. Two things happening at once. First, we're covering ethics and law, supervision ethics, dual relationship, technology and practice, and mandatory reporting. 4 domains, 1 episode, fully exam ready. Secondly, I'm doing something that I've been working on for a long time. Today is the official launch of the DSM Genie. This is a AI-powered DSM-5 study companion built specifically for pre-licensed therapists preparing for the NCE, NCM, HCE, working toward becoming a social worker. It walks you through diagnostic criteria, differential diagnosis, clinical vignettes, and the DSM-5 concepts that show up most consistently on the license exam. In a really conventional interactive format that goes deeper than flashcards. This is like a living flashcard. It can have a conversation with you. This is something that took me a couple of months to develop, and I'm pretty excited to get it out there for everybody. But you'll be able to access this through the Licensure Lifeline website. It's $15, one-time pay. You pay for it, you got access to it for as long as you need it. And before we go into the ethics content, one more thing. I co-host another podcast, and I know that as I'm saying this, I promised I would never advertise on this podcast. That's not something I'm going to do moving forward. But this one is something that I want to make sure everybody knows. I don't get money for this. But I co-host another podcast. It's nothing like this one. It's called Creepy Colorado with Kai. Kai is my daughter. She's 7 years old. We do a paranormal podcast together for kids. This started as a really fun project for me and her to do toward the end of the summer to help her with some of her reading skills. I'm also teaching her things like, how to use Adobe Audition and some other fun little things. Some of the stuff we actually go on site to do, some of the episodes. And she brings her little camera along and, we take pictures of the sites and we do some ghost investigation. The episodes are like 10 minutes long. If you have a little one in your life, this is a fun podcast to listen to. All right. As always, if this is your first episode, welcome. Go to LeicesterLifeline.com and download the free study roadmap PDF, complete 12 domains, NCE prep, And it's free, instant download. You can get that, and you'll also get signed up for the newsletter when you do that as well. So, make sure that you get that going. It's, again, all free. The newsletter goes deep. I take the stuff from the podcast. I go a little deeper on it with some little extra things just to add to your study process. Both of those things are available through LeisterLifeline.com, my website. And then also want to mention the Leister Lifeline Circle Group. This is an online community that I am have developed, that again, gives you further support around studying for the test. You're going to find quizzes there. You're going to find study guides there. I have a 2-week free trial that goes along with this. You can just try it out for 2 weeks, do whatever you want with it. If you want to go in there and download a bunch of the study guides, that's fine. I want people to get the most out of this, but if you decide to move forward with it, it's going to be $29.99 a month. You can cancel anytime. I make it really easy. And again, if you are a member of the group, you actually get the DSM Genie for free. That comes along with the group. That becomes something that you can just utilize for free. So that is it for announcements. Let's get going with the news. All right, we got a couple of stories for you. First up, the Supreme Court decision that every counselor needs to know about in Chiles versus Salazar. The U.S. Supreme Court overturned Colorado's ban on conversion therapy, the practice of attempting to change a person's sexual orientation or gender identity. The March 31st ruling directly compromises the ethical standards of the counseling profession as established by the ACA Code of Ethics. Here's why this matters for you beyond the headlines. The ACA Code of Ethics prohibits conversion therapy. State laws banning it has now been overturned in Colorado by the Supreme Court. What that creates is exactly the kind of tension this episode is about. The relationship between legal permission and ethical obligation. Something being legal does not make it ethical. The ACA Code still prohibits the practice. As a licensed clinician, you are bound by your ethical code, regardless of what state law permits. That distinction, legal versus ethical, is directly testable on your exam. And let me just say this, this is pretty important. We have a code of ethics, and you are bound to those codes of ethics. The case that can come against you if you do violate those ethical codes could put your licensure at risk. There are things that are just you're going to bump up against when it comes to kind of the ethical versus, what's the law? What are we bound to as clinicians to support the people that we are working with that come to us for support versus what the law says? The law in this case is saying conversion therapy is they've overturned the banning of conversion therapy. So while some people that might clear the way for some people to do conversion therapy, that doesn't ethically make it okay for us as therapists to do conversion therapy. And again, like I said, beyond it just not being something that you should do, it has been shown time and time again that this does not work, that it does more harm to the individual than any good. This is something that you could lose your profession over, that you are ethically bound to follow. So definitely something to keep in mind. Next up, a new ACA survey reveals professional counselors' concerns about consumers' use of AI for mental health therapy. With the rising popularity of artificial intelligence, clients are increasingly turning to AI for assistance, including mental health support. This is the frontier of technologies and ethics and practice, and it connects directly to what we're covering today. When a client tells you they've been using an AI chatbot between sessions, or that they prefer talking to the AI because it's available to them at 2 a.m., and that they start sharing things with an AI they haven't shared with you, that's a clinical and ethical moment. For trauma-informed practice especially, this risks are amplified. And, I think I said this a couple of episodes ago. We have to have this conversation now with our people. I have a handful of individuals that I am working with that supplement their therapy with AI. And it actually works really well. Like, a couple of them actually will send me some of the readouts from their AI. They will come into sessions with questions that the AI has asked them that the AI has told them to bring up with me. And it makes for really, really good conversations in our practice. The significance here, the thing that I think therapists really need to cue into is one, acknowledging that this is a thing. Because I think a lot of people will just kind of let it slide and pretend like it's not there. So just being able to bring it up and say, hey, is this part of your process? Like speaking to the client, is this part of your process for therapy? Are you utilizing AI as a way to get some support, some advice, whatever? And then, really considering like how you might integrate that into your work. This doesn't have to be something you battle against. This can absolutely be something that you can work in some balance with your people. I've had some really, really good experiences so far with individuals that are using AI as part of their process, especially with people that are struggling with money. People that can only see me once a month. They're using AI between sessions to kind of supplement that. And we do, like, they come into our sessions ready to go. Like, they have things that they want to talk about, things that they've been discussing with the AI. They have notes ready for the sessions. So, all that to say, this is a newer conversation that we are having with the people that we are working with, but is a conversation that needs to be had. Okay, let's get into the main topics today. So first up, we're going to go into supervision ethics. Clinical supervision is one of the most ethically complex relationships in the mental health field because the supervision holds responsibility for multiple parties simultaneously. The supervisee's professional development, the welfare of the supervisee's clients, and the integrity of the profession. The supervisor's primary obligation or primary ethical obligation, kind of, we break it down to a couple of different things. So competence in supervising is number one. Supervisors are ethically required to have training in supervision itself, not just in clinical practice. So your supervisor actually has to be trained to be a supervisor. You can't just say, hey, I'll volunteer for supervising. Like, you actually have to go through some training here. Being an excellent clinician does not automatically qualify you as someone that is a supervisor. And many states' licensing boards require specific supervision training hours to become a supervisor. Next up, informed consent and supervision. Supervisees must be informed at the outset about the nature of supervision, how their work will be evaluated, the limits of confidentiality with supervision, and the supervisor's obligation to disclose supervisee performance to the licensing board or training programs when required. I have seen supervising not go well for people. I remember, not very many, but definitely enough to leave an impression. People that went into their practicums, some of their other supervisions, and didn't last a month. Not because it was too hard or too difficult, but because it was such a bad experience. Their supervisors were just not where they needed to be with, their communication and things like that. I mean, that's huge. Communication with this point in our professional lives is so important. Not that it isn't in the rest of our lives, but this in particular, there's a lot of moving parts and a lot of things that need to be communicated. All right, next up, vicarious liability. Supervisors carry legal and ethical responsibility for clinical work of their supervisees. If a supervisee causes harm to a client, the supervisor may bear the responsibility, particularly if the supervisor failed to provide adequate oversight, failed to intervene when concerns arose, or failed to document supervision appropriately. And this is what why people don't go into supervision. You would think like, oh, this seems very cool. Like it's this like really neat mentory thing. And, as I get further along in my therapeutic practice, maybe this is something that I can do, because supervisors do get paid a little extra for doing supervision. And, it is a nice path for making a little extra money on the side as part of your clinical work. But there are responsibilities that you take on. There is liability that you take on. If you are not keeping up with your supervisees and they are causing harm, that falls on you. That falls on you. That falls on your license. So, definitely something to keep in mind. Next up, we have due process for supervisees. When a supervisor has concerns about a supervisee's competence, ethical behavior, or fitness for practice, the supervisee has a right to know about those concerns, to understand the specific behaviors at issue, to have the opportunity to respond, and to appeal decisions about that standing. Supervisors are not trying to weed people out. That is not what their job is. It is not to see who is going to be a great therapist and who is not going to be a great therapist. That's not what supervisors are doing. But they do have this obligation to evaluate. They have the obligation to evaluate. They have the obligation to really say like, hey, you're deficient in this area. You really need to up your game here, or tell you where you're amazing as well. But that's they want to get people to get you to that place to become a therapist. So they should work with you along the way toward that goal. And this is where a lot of us that everybody needs supervisory hours toward their full licensure. And this is often, this really nice space where specializations form. If you're interested in child therapy, sex therapy, couples counseling, all these different avenues for therapy, this is oftentimes where people like really start to develop this. They get in with a supervisor that has that practice already going and start working it on that path. Next up, gatekeeping function. Supervisors serve as gatekeepers to the profession. When a supervisee demonstrates persistent ethical violations, significant impairment, or professional behavior incompatible with clinical practice, the supervisor has an ethical obligation to take action up to including recommending the supervisee not continue the program or the profession. And I know what you're thinking. Didn't I just say that supervisors are not there to tell us who's a good therapist and who's a bad therapist? They aren't, but they are there to gatekeep against people that are unprofessional, to gatekeep against people that are, that are ethically shallow, that have some significant impairment in their ability to provide therapy. Those are the types of things that they're looking for. There are, a group of attributes for every therapist, some things that can be taught and some things that cannot be taught. And there are some combination of those two things that oftentimes just don't work for this profession. And part of the training of the supervisor is to be able to figure out, like, is this person going to make it in this profession? Lastly, the dual relationship in supervision. Supervisors must avoid dual relationships with supervisees that could compromise objectively or exploit the power of differentiation. A supervisor who is also a supervisee's therapist, romantic partner, close friend, business partner has a dual relationship that compromises the supervisory function. And, this happens. You get people that come out of their grad programs, they have friends that are already therapists, and they hit them up for being supervisors. Not everybody, again, you have to actually go down the path to become a supervisor. So this doesn't happen a ton. The amount of, I know, out of all the therapists I know, decent amount. I probably know 3 that do supervision. Not very many of the people I know do supervision. So this happens. It's something that you need to avoid. You're not going to get the most out of your practice. It might be a little bit easier, but you will. Like, you want to avoid this. All right, let's get into technology in practice. I talked about that news story. I think let's get a little bit deeper into that. So technology has really transformed clinical practice in ways that ethics codes are still catching up with. And this is a consistent thing that I have seen in the therapy world since I have been in school. Therapy is behind when it comes to technology, and it has been for a very long time. I used to go around to different therapy practices in Chicago, and I would do talks on video game addiction. I wouldn't call it video game addiction. I would call it, it would be something like, I can't remember. I didn't call it addiction, but I definitely lessened like that addiction phrase. I kind of took that out of there, even though it followed a lot of what we would see with addictive patterns. But therapy it really is just behind when it comes to technology in therapy and technology in mental health. So informed consent for telehealth must specifically address the unique aspects of the modality. The potentials for technology failures, the limits of confidentiality with the clients is a non-private environment. The procedures for handling crisis when the clinician cannot physically intervene, the jurisdictional questions of which state laws apply to clients are in different states. So what I just said there, specifically around telehealth, telehealth really didn't find its place until COVID hit. And I have not really gone back to the office since COVID. I have pretty much gone 100% telehealth at this point. Every once in a while, I'll see somebody face to face, but at this point in my career, I do telehealth. And if you think about, especially in a place like Colorado, this is awesome. In the wintertime, there's so many people that get snowed in and they can still do therapy with me. There are so many places that are just not accessible or that just therapists can't live. Like, it is crazy expensive to live in the mountains, like to live in your Vail area, your Aspen area, whatever. Your typical therapist can't afford to live in a lot of these places. So you have a lot of therapists that do telehealth for that reason. When I lived in Chicago, I saw people in the western suburbs and the eastern suburbs. Even though my office and my living space was all downtown, I got to really expand the amount of people I got to work with during COVID because I started taking people telehealth. And some of those people I worked with for years and never saw them in person. But it was a great relationship. I really, really liked it. But you need to be licensed in the state where the client is physically located. That is still the thing. I've talked about a couple of these episodes where they're working on parity with licensure in several states. And this is going slowly, but you run into some things that you need to be very conscious of with telehealth. You need to talk about what kind of plan is in place if you have somebody that you get that is suicidal. What is going to happen if they're talking about suicidality and they're not in your office? What does that plan look like? What does that plan look like for just support for people? There's a couple of different things that kind of come up here that just, this is a great way to do therapy, but there's things you need to keep in mind. All right, let's talk social media and electronic communication. Clinicians should have a clear written technology policy included in informed consent that addresses email communication, text messaging, social media contact, and clinical policies, searching for information on clients online, things like that. The ACA Code of Ethics addresses the obligation to maintain confidentiality in all electronic communication. So we use HIPAA compliant emails. None of my clients, I'm searchable through a lot of different social media platforms. I do not connect if a client sends me a request or something like that. I don't accept those. LinkedIn is the only exception to the rule. And that is, because LinkedIn is a more of a professional platform, I will connect with clients on LinkedIn. I have done resume reviews through LinkedIn. I've done profile reviews through LinkedIn as part of career counseling for the people I've worked with. But especially if I had somebody that I've worked with for years and years and years, and they are kind of done with therapy, and they're asking like, hey, how can I keep up with you and, keep up with the things that you're doing? I don't have a problem with giving them my LinkedIn profile, my professional profile. That tends to be fine with me. But you need to check your practices, codes and see what they allowed. You're going to need to see what your state allows. It's all kind of a thing. All right, finally, AI in clinical practice. The emerging guidance still developing as of 2006 points toward AI as appropriate for administrative functions, things like documentation, scheduling, billing, things like that, but inappropriate as a frontline clinical tool or crisis responder. So we don't want to point people in the direction of, hey, do all your therapy through AI. Not a huge surprise there, right? Clinicians using AI for documentation must be aware of data privacy implications of the platform they use, whether clients' information is being stored, whose access, and whether the platform is HIPAA compliant. You do need to be extremely careful with how you're using this. When I use AI in like the mental health world, if I'm curious about exploring borderline personality a little bit more with some things that I saw with somebody that I'm working with, which, I've done before, all identifying information is left out. I mean, I'm not even talking about, nothing about where they live, anything like that. I'll kind of do more of just kind of like a general inquiry around like, hey, if I have somebody that's experiencing this, and this, I think it's potentially borderline, but I would like to explore kind of like what this means with alcohol or what this means with eating disorders and things like that. That's kind of the extent to how I'll use AI with the capacity for like actually doing therapy. It's just kind of like exploring some of the ideas that I have around a therapeutic process more so than like, diagnose this person. All right, let's get into the next domain here as part of the main body of all of this. We're going to go into mandatory reporting. Mandatory reporting laws require clinicians to report specific types of harm to designated authorities, regardless of the confidentiality of the therapeutic relationship. These laws vary by state, but several core categories appear consistently across jurisdictions. So child abuse and neglect, first up. The most consistently mandated reporting category across all states, clinicians who have reasonable suspicions, not certainty, reasonable suspicions of child abuse or neglect are required to report. The threshold of suspicion, not proof. The clinician's job is to report that. Remember, we don't need to have proof. If we suspect it, if we have a strong suspicion that child abuse is going on here, then we need to report it. 4 types of child maltreatment. You have physical abuse, non-accidental physical injury, sexual abuse, any sexual contact or exploitation of a minor, emotional or psychological abuse, patterns of behavior that damage a child's emotional development, and then neglect, failure to provide for a child's basic physical, emotional, or educational needs. I do not work with kids. I think, especially now that I'm a parent, even seeing this list, I can feel kind of like a reaction to it, right? Like it's just to think of somebody hurting a kid, hurting a child. I have a very strong reaction to. It's one of the reasons why I don't think I could work with children. Just imagine being put in a situation where I'm working with somebody that I realize is being abused would not bode well for me. And I just absolutely love the people that I work with that work with kids, because I just know they're doing just amazing work with some of the hardest populations to work with. But this is a great area to work in. Extremely fulfilling, supporting children with mental health. And it is not, like some of the most intelligent individuals I know in the therapy world are child therapists. They work with children because you really need to be on top of your game. Just nothing but respect for people that work with kids. All right, let's get into adult protective services. Many states require reporting of abuse, neglect, or exploitation of vulnerable adults, including elderly individuals and adults with disabilities. Requirements vary significantly state by state. Duty to warn, duty to protect. When client makes a credible threat of serious harms identifiable third party, the clinicians may have legal, ethical obligation to take steps to protect the potential victim. The foundational case, Tarasoff versus Regents of the University of California. This was a 1976 case. This is something that is beat into our heads. I know all of you have heard Tarasoff versus Regents and the duty to warn over and over and over again. The Tarasoff ruling has been adopted, modified, or rejected in various forms across different states. In some states, the duty to warn is the potential victims directly. In other states, it takes responsible steps to protect, which includes warning or hospitalization of the client or contacting law enforcement. So again, I've never been in this situation. I've never been in a situation where I've had to warn somebody or call the police or hospitalize a client because I thought they were going to harm themselves or somebody else. I have been adjacent to a lot of those cases, but I've never actually had to do it myself. And I think there are certain fields, certain areas within the therapy world that you see this more often than others. I think specifically because of the areas that I tend to work in, I just don't see it as much. So then lastly, we have reporting imminent danger to self. While suicide risk is addressed primarily through clinical intervention rather than mandatory reporting, clinicians have ethical and sometimes legal obligation to take action when a client presents imminent danger to themselves. This may include contacting emergency services, initiating involuntary holds, or notifying family members. So, this is the whole thing with being able to really understand suicidality. I have had many conversations with clients around suicide risk, thoughts that they've had of suicide. But it's, again, never been elevated to the point of you are a risk to yourself and I need to hospitalize you. I have had maybe a handful of conversations where the client was in the process of, I think I need to be hospitalized, and they take that step for themselves. And I support them toward taking those steps. But I've never been in a situation where I've had to call somebody to say, hey, this person is a harm to themselves. But it is like, this is not something that is necessarily going to always jump out at you. It is something that you need to be on the lookout for. All right, let's get into some pattern recognition around this stuff. Here's the exam's lens for ethical and law questions. When the question involves a supervisor's responsibilities, think vicarious liability, competence in supervision, informed consent, due process for supervisees, and the gatekeeping function. When the question involves a relationship between clinicians and clients that extends beyond the therapy room, think dual relationship analysis. Is it prohibited, outright, sexual, romantic, with current clients? Does it create risk or harm to that? Somebody being exploited? Does it impair objectivity? That's when questions involve, involved relationship between clinician and clients. When the questions involve technology, telehealth, licensing, jurisdiction, informed consent, HIPAA, AI or administrative tools, not clinical tools, that's when we're really looking at tech. When the question describes harm to a child or vulnerable adults, mandatory reporting, the threshold is responsible. So, I'm going through all of this, and these are you're going to see this. And as you study, it's almost like you develop an alarm system in your head as you're reading these questions. This stuff starts to jump out at you. You're going to see like a little scenario describing a vulnerable child and immediately start thinking, oh, mandatory reporting. That's how this stuff comes up. That's why I'm kind of reading it this way. When the question involves a client's threatening to harm someone, TerraSoft, right? That's your TerraSoft alarm system is going to go off. Anything involving threat to harm someone, that's one of the alarm bells that's going to go off for you. And finally, key ethical distinctions that runs through everything. Legal does not equal ethical. Okay, say it with me. Legal does not equal ethical. Something being permitted by law does not make it ethically appropriate. And sometimes being ethically required does not mean it is legally mandated. Clinicians are not bound by both and must navigate the tension when they diverge. Let's get into some multiple choice questions. A licensed professional counselor is providing clinical supervision to a pre-licensed therapist in a community mental health setting. One of the supervisee's clients discloses suicidal ideation during a session. The supervisee does not conduct a risk assessment, does not consult with the supervisor, and does not document the disclosure. The client is not harmed, but the supervisor discovers the lapse during a case review. Which of the following most accurately describes the supervisor's ethical obligation in this situation? Is it A, the supervisor has no ethical obligation to act because the client was not harmed? B, the supervisor must address the supervisee's clinical failure directly, provide corrective guidance, increase oversight, and document the supervisory response. C, the supervisor should report the supervisee to the licensing board immediately. Clinical errors always require external reporting. Or D, supervisor's only obligation is to ensure the client receives appropriate follow-up care. Answer is going to be B. Supervisors carry vicarious liability for the clinical work of their supervisees, meaning they must bear ethical legal responsibility for the supervisee's errors, particularly when adequate oversight was not provided. The ethical response involves directly addressing the lapse with the supervisee, providing corrective instructions, increasing oversight of the supervisee's work with high-risk clients. All right. Memory strategy for this. Supervisors equal vicarious liability. When a supervisee makes a clinical error, the supervisor's obligations are address it directly, correct it, increase oversight, document the response. Got it? Question number 2. A therapist has been working with a client for 2 years. The client terminates therapy 3 months later, asks the therapist to become his business partner in a new counseling practice. The therapist is interested in the venture and believes the therapeutic relationship has clearly resolved at termination. According to the ACA Code of Ethics, which of the following must accurately describe the ethical analysis? Is it A, the business relationship is permitted because the therapeutic relationship has not been formally terminated? B, the 3-month period since termination is sufficient to establish an appropriate boundary between the therapist and the business relationship? C, the ethical analysis requires examining whether the business relationship creates risk of harm, impairs objectivity, or exploits the former client. The power differential and intimacy of the therapeutic relationships do not automatically dissolve at termination. Or D, business relationships with former clients are always prohibited, regardless of the time since termination. The answer to this one is going to be C. ACA Code of Ethics does not impose a blanket prohibition on all non-sexual relationships with former clients, but it does require careful analysis. The therapeutic relationship creates a power differential and intimacy of persistent boundary termination. A business partnership with a former client creates significant potential for exploitation, role confusion, and impaired objectivity, particularly at only 3 months past termination. So an ethical analysis needs to be done here. It really needs to be considered, could this risk harming the person? With relationships, especially post-therapy relationships, that question always has to be asked. How much harm is this going to have for the person, for the client, right? Question number 3, a counselor is providing telehealth services to a client who lives in a different state than the counselor's primary license. During a session, the client discloses suicidal ideation with a plan. The counselor realizes she does not know the client's current physical location, only the city where the client lives. Which of the following most accurately identifies the primary ethical failure in this scenario? Is it A, the counselor should not be providing telehealth therapies to a client in a different state without a license in that state? B, the counselor's informed consent process failed to establish the client's physical location and local emergency resources, a specific requirement for ethical telehealth practices. C, the counselor should have referred the client to an in-person therapist given the suicidal ideation history. Or D, the counselor has no ethical obligation to know the client's physical location. Emergency services can be located by phone number. Answer to this is going to be, what do you think? B, while interstate licensing is a genuine concern, option A, the most immediate ethical failure is the scenario is an informed consent gap. Ethical telehealth practices require establishing the client's physical location at the start of each session, not just their home city, and have local emergency contacts for that location documented as accessible. This is something to keep in mind with your clients, especially if, anything around suicidality has been established from the first couple of meetings. I mean, even if they go on vacation, I would want to have the conversation with them around like, okay, where's emergency services? What do you have access to? I mean, this is all going to be your call. But these are things that you need to be thinking of when you're doing things like telehealth, when you're working with people that are away, and they have to be based in where you're living and what those code of ethics say. Memory strategy for this: telehealth informed consent must include client's physical location at each session, local emergency contacts for that location, procedures for technology failures, and confidentiality limits specific to telehealth context. Question number 4, a therapist is seeing a 10-year-old child for anxiety. During a session, the child mentions that her stepfather hits her with a belt when she's bad. The child says it happens sometimes and asks the therapist not to tell anyone. The therapist is uncertain whether this rises to the level of abuse. The child does not seem afraid of the stepfather and says she knows he loves her. Which of the following most accurately describes the therapist's ethical legal obligation? Ooh, this is a tough one. Is it A, the therapist should gather more information over the next few sessions to determine whether the hitting constitutes abuse before making a report? B, the therapist should consult with the child's mother before making any report. Parental consent is required before reporting the child to protective services. C, the therapist is mandated reporter and is required to report to child protective services based on a reasonable suspicion. The threshold for reporting is not certainty of abuse, and the therapist's job is to report, not to investigate. That's what child services does, right? And D, the therapist is not required to report because the child does not appear to be frightened and has expressed affection for the stepfather. All right, what do you guys think with this one? Answer is going to be C. Mandated reporting laws require action at the threshold of reasonable suspicion, not certainty, not proof, and not the clinician's professional assessment of whether abuse is occurring. So we suspect a reasonable abuse. This girl is telling us she's being physically punished. And regardless, this has to bypass what your beliefs are around, the parents' ability to discipline their children or to reprimand their children. If you were raised in a way where physical hitting was part of punishment, that could kind of mess with your ability to really look through this and be able to say, like, this is abuse. At minimum, this raises to the level of you need to go have a conversation with your supervisor immediately. I mean, if you just feel something in your gut that's like, you feel a battle going on, your next step is going to talk immediately to your supervisor about what you have experienced, what you have heard, or what you have seen. So mandated reporting threshold equals reasonable suspicion, not certainty. A child disclosing physical discipline that causes pain or marks equals report. Clinician's job is to report, not to investigate. All right, that is going to be it for the episode. Thank you so much for sticking with me until the end here. So, a couple of things. First up, legal does not equal ethical. Something being permitted by law does not make it ethically appropriate. The ACA Code of Ethics binds you regardless of what state laws permit, hold both standards, and when they diverge, meet the higher of the two. Okay, do you get that? Number 2, mandatory reporting threshold is reasonable suspicion, not certainty. A child disclosing physical harm meets the threshold. Your job is to report. Your job is to report, not to investigate. Lastly, dual relationship analysis requires examining risk of harm, impaired objectivity, and exploration, not just the presence of a second relationship. Some dual relationships are unavoidable. The question is always whether this one creates a meaningful risk. Remember the newsletter this week. It goes deeper into all of this stuff. Gives you a nice way to just underline the things I said in this episode. Before we close this episode, remember you get that free roadmap if you sign up for or you can sign up for the newsletter through the website, leicesterlifeline.com. You can get the free roadmap. Also take a look at the circle group. Again, through the website, you get a 2-day free trial, 14 days, and then it's $29 a month. You can cancel anytime if you want to take a look there. And then take a look at the DSM Genie. I am in the works of creating other products like this. I would love to get some feedback on this and see how this one worked. I think I've said this before. I'm not a tech person. I just play one on TV. And I work really hard to make this stuff come to life. So take a look. Tell me if it's working. I'd love to get some feedback on it and see how that goes. That is available through the website. You see it right at the top of the page. It says DSM Genie. And then don't forget, take a look at my daughter's podcast. That's Creepy Colorado with Kai. She's 7 years old. Especially if you're not in the United States, she gets such a huge kick out of people that are in other countries listening to the podcast. And she has people in Japan, in Saudi Arabia, South America, listening to the podcast. And she has like a little map that she marks all these places on. It's super, super cute, super fun to watch. But Thank you, everyone. Thank you for the time you're putting in to become a therapist. I appreciate you. And until next time, never stop learning.